Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor Jon V. Kofas has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello everyone, welcome to a session on human nature and war from the classical period of Greece to the present, to NATO. I want to begin by pointing out that there have been a number of scholars who have debated this issue throughout history, and we will look at it and determine to what degree human beings have an innate propensity toward mass destruction. This is to be distinguished from human tendency for individual violence, succumbing to the irrational aspect of the human mind and resorting to individual violence. In fact, I will have a session, the next session will be on violence in society, and as we'll see there, I subdivide violence into individual, cultural, and structural. War falls into the category of structural violence, which of course has an impact on cultural violence and invariably on individual behavior and individual violence. Now, if we assume, again, as some scholars have, that wars to varying degrees, okay? And we have two major ones today, Ukraine and Israel, as examples right now for people who are following those events to determine for yourselves the validity of this thesis. But some scholars have argued, and I wholeheartedly agree with them, that all wars in varying degrees impact civilians, and that the victims of war are in fact civilians. Civilians who, through no fault of their own, find themselves subjected to structural violence. Decisions to go to war from the beginning of civilization in the Sumerian city-states, modern day Iraq, when governments, military leaders made no secret that the aim for war was to loot other people, to take their possessions, and to take their trade routes and subjugate them. They were honest about it. That sort of honesty, of course, fades as civilization unfolds, as we will see by 5th century Athens, and certainly to this day, the arguments become theoretical on why war is inevitable and necessary. And there are academic scholars today, as there were since the time of Plato and Aristotle, as we will see, who argue, yes, of course, war is inevitable. It's inescapable. It's inescapable to have war. That is the argument that has been the argument. And the question is there any propensity in human beings in general for war, for mass destruction, for structural violence, including, by the way, mass killing of children, as we have seen throughout history, including today. As you know, children are victims of war, have always been. Civilians and children are victims of war. So if we accept this, again, assumption, which I fully embrace, as I said, and a number of scholars, at least I shouldn't say many, a number of scholars embrace, which is that war impacts civilians. It is an act of structural violence against civilians. Then all wars are criminal. They are criminal because it is the intention of those determining policy to eliminate, physically eliminate, to destroy en masse, on a massive scale, other groups of people for the sake of power, glory, and greed. So the question that is raised here is, who determines who makes the determination from the period of the first civilization on this planet, Sumerian civilization, in the Mesopotamian region, modern day Iraq? Who makes the decision to go to war? Is it some farmer or some peasant, some slave, some worker? Ever in the history of civilization? Has there ever been consent for war by the lower echelons of society? No. War has always been the domain of the elites. Those in the military, political, economics, socioeconomic elites, as well as we will see, the religious domain when we come to the Crusades, and an era also that some scholars call papal imperialism. Having said that, I should tell you that the 20th century is estimated to be the bloodiest in structural violence in all human history of 5,500 years. The 20th century, with 2 global wars and wars in between. Before World War I, the interwar era, and during the Cold War. It is estimated, I believe the first figure was by the great historian Eric Hobsbawm, 187 million perished. That's on the low side. There are figures as many as 270 million. So we are talking about a huge number of people dying in wars. This does not count the injured and those devastated, economically suffering economic consequences of war, because war has economic consequences. If you follow today, both in Ukraine and Israel, you know this. You know that there are millions of people, 1/3 of the population of Ukraine, internal or external refugees, either internal refugees dislocated internally or they've left. 1/3 of the country. Not to mention what is happening in what the ICC, the International Criminal Court, calls the genocidal war in Israel to the Palestinians. Also, victims, not just in terms of the actual casualties, but also the economic squeeze, deliberate, by the way, imposed famine and a war crime, including just this morning, I was watching the BBC earlier, and there was an American official who argued that water has been targeted as a good. Water, by the way, is a human right. People have the right to water. Without water, they die. In Gaza. Anyway, this week there is a NATO meeting in Washington D.C. Started yesterday, and the NATO meeting, and this, because I'm only mentioning it because of this session, which is entitled Human Nature of War from Classical Greece to NATO. NATO is resolute, it has resolved that it will continue to expand, it will continue the war of attrition, proxy war of attrition in Ukraine, rather than coming forward and at least discussing diplomatic solutions, because no war has been resolved in the absence of a diplomatic solution. Even those that have a military solution, like World War I, the Allies won, Germany and her allies, Austria, lost. But at the end, there was the Versailles Treaty. You have to come to the negotiating table after the war and negotiate the peace terms. No matter what, war either ends through diplomatic channels, or even after a military solution, which is the worst possible scenario, you still have to have a diplomatic framework to determine the aftermath, to determine the limitations of each country, and to avoid the next, hopefully, the next conflict. Now, having said all this, I want to, as an introduction, by the way, I want to point out that from ancient times to the present, there have been many prominent thinkers, most in fact, who have argued that, yeah, war is not nice, it's not good, obviously. War means mass destruction. It's what scholars call an integral part of structural violence, period. However, war may actually be natural to human nature. It's always been there. Human beings are aggressive, like animals in the animal kingdom. So, of course, why should we question? Plato and Aristotle, along with, as we will see, Christian thinkers with some reservations like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, the two Western theologians who set the foundation for Catholic doctrine, agreed that war is part of society. There is nothing in the social contract that says that human beings should go to war. And again, there is no consent when it comes to war by the public. War is decided by those in the state, carrying out state functions, military policy, defense policy, and to pursue certain interests, to further certain interests. And we'll explore this further. Plato and Aristotle, as well as, and I don't want to just because we're in the West here, at least I am, that the fact is that in Asia, Asian religions, non-Western religions, Hinduism, for example, and Islam abhorred structural violence. However, Okay? However, the fact is that they found room for it, as did Christianity, as did Islam, to allow for it. There is also a difference between the spiritual texts and the reality of religion being used to justify war from the pagan era to Hinduism. Buddhism is the exception, by the way, to Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Judaism. Okay, there is that the texts speak of spiritual transcendence and peace and tranquility and all that. However, the leadership carrying out the policy for military decisions invokes religion, knowing that the masses embrace religion to carry out war. Some religions have justified war in the name, namely Judaism, Islam, and to some degree Christianity, in the name of religion itself. Let me give you an example. Some of you, most of you maybe, know the story of the two brothers, Cain and Abel, in the Bible, the Old Testament. Cain and Abel were brothers. Abel was an individual, a man who sought constructive pursuits in life and tried to, and was peacefully oriented and tried to do things in life that were harmonious. And when God asked for gifts from both, God accepted the gift of Abel, rejected the gift of Cain. Cain, out of jealousy, rage, what psychologists would call today, I guess, with inferiority complex, a sense of wanting to assert his power, killed his brother. This is the first act of violence, according to the biblical text in biblical history, of course. Okay? When I took a course in world religions from a brilliant theologian, was I believe Belgian, in Chicago, he argued that Cain and Abel are two sides of the same coin of human nature. That human beings have a propensity toward violence, and they have a propensity toward harmony and peace and constructiveness and coexistence. That human beings are complex. And the Cain and Abel story is that. However, when applied either to individual violence, as we'll see in the next session on society and violence, or to structural, what you see here is people who believe that the reason we have war is because human beings have a propensity to war. Here is Cain and Abel. It's in the Bible. Who's going to dispute that? The fact is, Judaism, Islam, and to some degree Christianity have used that story to argue that, yes, you see, there's the story of Cain and Abel. Of course, human beings are warring people. They have a tendency to destroy their own species. Other species have a tendency to destroy their own species for survival for several reasons. Human beings, I remember there was a professor at Northwestern University in Chicago, who argued that, according to his studies, they are a rare breed insofar that, in addition to destroying their own species, as do other animals, by the way, they also take pleasure in it. And this is in war. And you can see it when they celebrate the death, the mass destruction and death of other people. And since ancient times, they made offerings to the gods, or to God if they were monotheists. And when the Portuguese went to Africa, they held the cross up high and they were chasing Africans to enslave them in the name of Christ. So, in the name of religion, whether paganism or monotheism, structural violence, war, okay, in this case, for other purposes, has used religion to convince the masses, to indoctrinate them that this is who we are. And besides, our Creator made us this way. At least when we fell from grace, in other words, the Adam and Eve story, violating the will of God by not doing what God dictated in the Garden of Eden. So this is an important argument that has been made. And by the way, thinkers, consciously or unconsciously, whether they refer to it or not, Niccolo Machiavelli did not, Thomas Hobbes did, by the way, have used this argument to justify the aggressiveness of human nature and the propensity of human beings to war. The question is, in my view, whether this is accurate, empirically accurate. I don't want to use the word scientifically, but empirically, is there any evidence for that? Yes, people are indoctrinated and are enthusiastic, and you can see them to this day dancing in the streets when the enemy, other human beings of their own species, have been mass murdered in the battlefield, including children, by the way, including babies, which speaks volumes about human beings. In my view, the indoctrinated masses have been indoctrinated by the elites. Wars have always been carried out by elites for the interest of other elites, that is, political elites for power, economic, socioeconomic elites for the benefit of greed, for the glory, for military elites of war. So the elites who determine what Antonio Gramsci, and I've mentioned this in other videos, calls the hegemonic culture, which then influences subcultures and popular culture, indoctrinate the masses, and of course they become enthusiastic. We'll see when we come to existentialism and war, how existentialist philosophers, existentialist thinkers, from T.S. Eliot to Jean-Paul Sartre, Hannah Arendt, how they explain all of this. The masses have never in the history of, that is the ordinary people, have never in the history of civilization ever benefited from war. They pay the price. The only beneficiaries have been the elites at the expense of mass destruction of other groups of people. Now, to convincingly indoctrinate the masses from ancient times to this day, and you can see this in Israel, by the way, in the so-called Gaza war, we see that there are those who invoke apocalyptic doctrines for war. The idea of an apocalypse has religious undertones. The parties going to war always have God on their side and good. And war is a struggle between good and evil. Of course, both sides think they're good, that the other side is evil. And that the war has some transcendent meaning, some higher meaning from the ancient Greeks, from ancient Greece, from the ancient Greeks. To this day, war has some transcendent meaning. It's about something higher than the individual human being who must be sacrificed and must kill others, okay, and sacrifice himself, herself in the process. In 1937, when Japan annexed Manchuria, the northeast part of China, where up there where Beijing is, there was a Japanese, and they renamed it Manchukuo, by the way, Japanese name. There was a Japanese commander. He was eventually dismissed from his post, but he argued that a war of apocalyptic dimensions was inevitable, and it would be between the United States and Japan, and that this would be to determine the fate of the entire planet for eternity. He argued, not just for 10 years or 100, eternity. Okay. There are evangelical Christians today in the United States, as well as other parts of the world, rooting for the Zionist state of Israel carrying out ethnic cleansing in Palestine for apocalyptic reasons. It's a prophecy. It's to be fulfilled. Mass annihilation of human beings is justified through this venue. I want to now go to some specific thinkers. I mentioned Plato and Aristotle. I want to go to some specific thinkers, again, going back to the period of Plato and Aristotle, the contemporary. One of my favorite historians, probably my favorite historian of all time, one of my ancestors, Thucydides, or as they call him in Greek, Thucydides. Thucydides was a Armenian general and a historian. He's considered the first scientific historian. The reason for the term scientific is because he looked at both sides of the war between Athens and its allies and Sparta and her allies, and did not allow the reader to make to reach the conclusions. He didn't write. A brilliant mind. Thucydides is reached the conclusion. I'm not. This is a multi-volume work about the Peloponnesian War, which lasted about 30 years, at the tail end of the 5th century, and destroyed all of classical Greece. And this brings us into the Hellenistic era of Philip of Macedon and, of course, Alexander the Great. Anyway, Thucydides, in his brilliance, presents Athens as this open society, like the US and the G7 claim to be open societies. A democratic society, very different concept of democracy, by the way, in Athens, radical democracy or direct democracy, than representative what we have here. I've explained this in other videos. Um, and here's an open society, a democratic society. It welcomes foreigners. Sparta, a closed society, doesn't like foreigners coming in, doesn't welcome foreigners. Militaristic society, Athens, devoted to the arts, to the humanities, to theater, to music, to sculpture. All of that is true, by the way. Except that the way Thucydides goes about is to show this democratic state, the Athenian state, which was pursuing militarism to advance the interests, the commercial interests of Athens, the interests of merchants and traders. Okay? And Sparta, which was in fact a militaristic society, one of the most militaristic societies in history, is Sparta. And the reason they were militaristic, by the way, maybe this is a good chance for me to inject this concept on human nature and war. The reason it was militaristic is because the Spartans were actually invaders from the north. They came down from the north, from the northwest. They settled in the southern part of the Peloponnesian Peninsula, enslaved the native population, put them to work for them, and they devoted themselves to military affairs and guarding the slaves, fearing a slave rebellion from the people they enslaved on their own land, whose land they took, and then they exploited their labor. Of course, they're going to be militaristic. Militarism is usually inevitable when a state either has designs or is practicing occupation, exploitation of other people's land and their labor. Of course, they're going to be military. How else they're going to guard these people they're exploiting and their land? What? They're going to give them flowers? They have to do it by the sword back then. Okay? That hasn't changed. In 2,500 years, that has not changed. Structurally, that holds to this day. The other thing that the reason I'm mentioning Thucydides, by the way, is because some modern scholars today are making comparisons between the Spartan Athens power struggle and US and China. China is obviously interested in global economic integration and global economic hegemony. And all you have to do is look at what they spend for defense, GDP, defense spending as a percent of GDP versus the US and NATO. And there's your answer. This doesn't mean, by the way, that China is not increasing defense spending. It is in response to the West, to NATO and the West, and Japan and South Korea. It doesn't mean that China is handing flowers either. They're preparing for the worst. But their main focus they have made, this is a long, consistent focus from the 1970s to the present, this is a 50-year commitment, is global economic hegemony. So it's not, they're using the economy as the instrument of hegemony, whereas the G7, NATO, is using the military, very different. So the conditioning, the indoctrination of human nature in there is very different than it is in the West, which tends to be much more pro-militaristic. Although, globally, by the way, according to public opinion polls, including the West, the majority of the people prefer political solutions or diplomatic solutions, if you like, to ending conflict and not starting one to begin with. I want to make sure that that point is driven across. It's the elites. And today, through modern means of communication, obviously the mass media and social media, it's very much easier. It's the elites that promote militarism and structural violence on a mass scale, okay? And then they deflect that and they argue, well, the people, they support all of it. They support what we're doing. Okay? So when you indoctrinate them, bombard them endlessly with militarism messages, and that the enemy is trying to destroy us, although you're sending the bombs, even the state of Israel, bombing to oblivion Gazan civilians, okay? This doesn't mean that Hamas is not responding, and Hezbollah from Lebanon, from southern Lebanon, they are responding. But that's nothing to the mass destruction. You can look at the statistics on your own. That's nothing in comparison to the mass destruction that has been visited. You can look at the United Nations statistics, by the way, upon the Palestinians. The numbers speak for themselves. There's no escape from that reality. I want to move on from Thucydides to the Catholic Church. The two major theologians of the Middle Ages, one St. Augustine in the late 5th century, the other in the early 5th century, sorry, and the other St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. In the 13th century, these towering theologians who define Catholic doctrine are the ones responsible for something some of you may have heard of, some of you may not have. The concept of just war theory, that war is justified under limited circumstances. Both believed that war, they were Christians, both believed that war was a sin, that it was a reflection of the sin, the original sin, the sin of man. Both lamented war. They both believe that, in fact, war has been part of human history. It continues. However, if it is to end injustice and to bring lasting peace, if it is to bring about harmony in society, so be it. The just war theory has been used since these two people by those who follow the Catholic Church, of course. And it doesn't mean that they don't support war. And it doesn't mean, by the way, that even after the just war theory, the papacy itself did not endorse war, namely the Crusades. From the 11th century to the 12th century, for 200 years, 200 plus years, actually, if you count all the Venetian, even longer. So what you have is the Catholic Church itself, which of course accepted St. Augustine and St. Thomas, practicing warring practices, sending crusaders to Jerusalem to capture the Holy Land, when in fact the only goal was to capture commercial routes that the Arabs controlled. And then, of course, they went to Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, by the way, I should point out, modern-day Istanbul, Turkey, and there, that's where it becomes very obvious what the real purpose was, because the Byzantine Empire was Christian. They were Orthodox, but they were Christian. They were not Muslims. You can argue, well, Muslims, the enemy, okay. What about the Byzantine Empire? Nowhere to hide in terms of doctrine. Nowhere. This is where hypocrisy is out front, you see. Now, Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli, an Italian thinker of the 15th century, and Thomas Hobbes of the 17th century, both supported war. And both attributed war to human nature, not to the elites, to human nature. Human beings, okay, carrying the seeds of evil from the fall of grace, from the original sin business, Adam and Eve, violating the will of God, human beings have a propensity toward destruction, destroying each other, violence. Um, Machiavelli was a little bit more reserved than Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, who lived during the 1640s through the Civil War in England, when he saw mass bloodshed, was much more pessimistic about human beings. He believed that they were irrational and destructive and chaotic. He had the worst assumptions about human nature and generalized, of course. Okay, did not generalized. Of course, is by the way, maybe I said it too quickly. Generalized, of course, without looking at who was leading the masses toward this mass destruction. The elites that he supported and elites he opposed. Okay, that's who were behind this. It wasn't some English peasant in the countryside. They were dragged along, as usually. Just like a soldier who works as a dock worker today in Russia or Ukraine is dragged along in this war. These people don't make decisions. The elites make decisions. The elites drag the masses. Their human nature, it's their nature that's responsible for war. Not all human nature, the human nature of the elites. Never in history has some peasants, some farmers, some workers, ordinary person ever decided on a major task like carrying out war against an enemy. This is the domain of the elites. Okay, then if that's who makes the decision, that's who has the propensity for warring tendencies. They have warring tendencies. That's who has warring tendencies. Not the person who is following, or even the person who is enthusiastic, by the way. Yeah, they're enthusiastic because they identify with some greater entity. Besides, there are penalties if you don't support it in most countries, in many countries throughout history, by the way. In the early 16th century, a brilliant Dutch theologian, Desiderius Erasmus was his name, wrote a work called Anti-Polemos. Polemos is a Greek word, which means war. In other words, anti-war. The essay was anti-war. And Erasmus had been influenced by the Renaissance. He was influenced by the rationalist tradition of the 17th century. And the scientific revolution, by the way, took place in the 17th century. Erasmus argued, but again, he was a theologian. He argued that the combination of human reason, and human faith, in a higher faith resting in a higher moral order, religious principles, that is, I should say, should lead human beings to reject categorically mass destruction, namely war. Erasmus was the exception, by the way. Erasmus was the exception. He was not in the mainstream. The mainstream thinkers were in favor of war and looked at it as the norm. And I want to point out that intellectuals throughout history normalized in the minds of the masses, they made it the norm for society to have war, as though it were written in the social contract. War is natural. Why? Well, there are all sorts of reasons. Cain and Abel story in the Bible, animals fight in the jungle, were violent. It's natural to have mass destruction, including, by the way, mass destruction of civilians. The Romans, for a long time during the Republic, during the Carthaginian, during the Punic Wars against Carthage, had a policy of wiping out after they captured a place, enslaving, and then also wiping out not just adult males, but women and children. Okay? The Athenians, Thucydides pointed out, since I brought up the Romans, I'm going to bring up Thucydides again. The Athenians pointed out that what gives the right to Athens to conquer, and the brilliant Thucydides answers, the Athenians answer, Thucydides, of course, uses this in the Melian dialogue. It's a part of the book called the Melian dialogue, in the great island, beautiful island of Milos, by the way. Might makes right. We have the power to do it, so we're doing it. So the Athenians were honest enough to saying the reason we're doing this is because we're more powerful. So power gives us the right to do this to you. Guess what? This is 2,500 years ago, the mindset of states, empires, and nation states to this day. Why are we doing this? We have the means to do it and the power to do it. So therefore, succumb to our wishes, accept subjugation because we're superior. We have the military means to do it, to destroy you, or to have you ally with us. Otherwise, you face destruction. You see, this is the logic. This is the true logic of war. Not any natural, innate propensity. Oh, war is nice. War is something that we welcome. Destroying our own species on a mass scale. I want to jump to, because I see I've taken too long already and there's a lot more material. I want to jump to World War I and Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States, who came from a Democrat, by the way, who came from a progressive Democrat, and also, by the way, an academic at Princeton University. He came from the progressive tradition, Democrat, and the reason I'm mentioning President Wilson is because he does carry the logic of war from the ancient times to the present, and he passes on this legacy to the future generations, including today, what's going on with the West. Wilson created what American diplomatic historians call missionary diplomacy. Missionary diplomacy means that the United States is under a mandate from God to impose its system of government, American democracy, on others. Mexico was one of those. Denies sovereignty to Mexico, which wanted to include, by the way, in its constitution during the Mexican Revolution of the 1910s, a clause that the subsoil rights of Mexico belong to Mexico, meaning oil and minerals. That's what subsoil is. Wilson said no. They sent the Navy down there and the Marines. You can't put that in the Constitution. We have to democratize you at gunpoint through war. So Wilson equated democracy and the mission of democratizing the world. Democracy, by the way, This is, you can't have, you can't send troops to democratize a country. You can't subjugate and force people to and deny their sovereignty. That's a contradiction in terms. And yet he equated it, and yet this remained, with the exception of a small period of time in US history called the good neighbor policy under Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State under Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s, early 1940s. The rest of American history in the 20th century is this kind of thinking. Accept our dictates under the guise of democracy. So war is justified in democracy. If you look at every war the US fought, from Vietnam to the Gulf War, to Iraq, to Afghanistan, to Libya, to Syria, covert wars in Syria, we're trying to democratize you. Sending planes and bombing and the Marines, that's an military occupation. That's democracy. What if Canada, hypothetical, ridiculous example, which is a non-entity, 10% of the population of the US, by the way, militarily couldn't possibly do anything to the US. But what if Canada did that to the US? You don't like the way, you don't like your kind of democracy. We'll democratize you. Groups will occupy you. 20 years, just like the US occupied Afghanistan. You see, this is the issue here. And yet, this is the doctrine that has been passed on to the masses, and there is a great deal, a large percentage of the American people who have in fact accepted the idea that the United States was not in Afghanistan and Iraq, was not in Vietnam, did not bomb Libya, did not take part indirectly through Saudi Arabia in Yemen, did not bomb Lebanon in the 80s under Reagan, is not supporting Israel today, is not supporting Ukraine for any other reason. We want to democratize, we want to spread democracy. And yet in every single country, when you look at the result, the end result is no democracy anywhere in those places. None. So if you judge by results, and all of you, as am I in my academic career, all of us are judged by results, by not what we say, the rhetoric, which is vacuous, what we do. All of us. States are judged by policies they pursue. When you judge by policy and the end result, what do you have? Democracy after 20 years in Afghanistan? It's the Taliban who prevailed and are back. That's the result. After so many millions of people were displaced, killed, injured in the process, to the tune of trillions to the Afghanistani and the US economies. And yet, the leadership would have you believe for democracy, and that the public support for this was very good support. And in fact, there was no support. It was very thin. It's true that people live through delusions, because self-deception and delusions make life, thank God for that, by the way, because it makes life easier to cope with. God knows life is a tragedy for a lot of people, and for all of them at some point in their lives. And self-delusions and self-deceptions, delusions and self-deceptions help. It helps to have them and to cope through life. But discounting for that, reality sinks in eventually. After 20 years, it was very obvious. There was no democracy in Afghanistan. There was a huge rise in the opium trade, by the way, under US occupation, when in fact it had subsided substantially before. Okay. So what was it? What was it? It was a power play to counter Iran and China and to have a foothold in this country, which is strategically important. For whose benefit? And what was it that the goal, whatever the goal obviously was geoeconomic and geopolitical, why couldn't that be accomplished through other means? Why did it have to be mass destruction of this country? Not to mention Iraq. Anyway, I want to, seeing that we're close to the end of my session, I recently read an article by a former State Department official who worked at the UN as well, U.S. representative, worked there as well, which sort of shocked me, because this individual who embraces the neoliberal militarist model of U.S. policy today and during the Obama administration, somewhat Trump, by the way, Trump deviated his new isolationist policies in some respect. He tried to act, he did say that it's wrong to, I want to be fair to the individual, he did say that it's wrong to kill civilians in war, which, by the way, it's not just wrong, it's a war crime. I want to make sure that people understand the United Nations has declared this a war. This is the reason that the ICC made the decision about Israel that it did what it's doing in Gaza, it's been doing in Gaza. It's a war crime. You can't mass bomb civilian children. That's a crime. Anyway, this individual tried to reduce everything to the most rudimentary common denominator, the very basic common denominator, which is collateral damage. Let's just call it collateral damage. Remember, when I started this session of an hour ago, I said that all wars are criminal because civilians in varying degrees are the victims of all wars. This individual, representing the US and the neoliberal militarist school of thought, argues, well, let's just not go to that extreme. It's collateral. It's not intended. They should be careful not to kill civilians, which we hear all the time, by the way, even by the people shooting the civilians. They shouldn't be doing this, but it's collateral damage. Collateral damage for what? It's not an object. You're not shooting in a cornfield and shooting down corn husks. They're killing children. That's not collateral damage. It's ending the life of a human being on a mass scale. Placating the public. You see, this is how indoctrination from above, from the hegemonic culture, filters down to the public. This makes it okay. It's collateral damage. What are you going to do? No, you can't make an omelet, as this saying goes in the United States, without breaking a few eggs. Those eggs are the lives of children. That's a war crime. Vacuous rhetoric can't cover that up. I want to end this. I am up on the hour, by the way. Sorry for going a little bit over. By pointing out that after World War I, there was a debate between Einstein and Albert Einstein, the brilliant physicist, and Sigmund Freud. There were other writers including Oswald Spengler, who wrote The Decline of the West, a German scholar who wrote Decline of the West, T.S. Eliot, who wrote Hollow Man, existentialist writers of the interwar period and the early interwar period, who were very pessimistic about Western civilization because of World War One. Because the Europeans assumed that the Enlightenment era, based on principles of rationalism, if you follow principles of rationalism of the Enlightenment era, all human and institutional problems can be solved rationally through institutional solutions, including the problem of war. War is obviously the ultimate crime. Albert Einstein remained a rationalist. He was a socialist, by the way, just for the record. He was a socialist. He was a pacifist. Sigmund Freud was a pessimist, unlike Albert Einstein. He argued that human beings are irrational. They have a propensity for violence because of the irrational aspect in them, and he wasn't optimistic, especially in his work, not just in his correspondence with Einstein, but also in his work, Civilization and Its Discontents. It's very clear he's not optimistic. And to some degree, you can argue, okay, he has a point. Human beings did display elements of irrationalism, but which human beings were swept up and viewed war as, oh my God, there's war finally, when it first erupted in August 1914. War at last, something to do. Life is so boring. Let's go to war. Okay, there is an element of that. But who prepared the masses, including, by the way, elements of the socialist wing, socialist parties, who were also swept up by nationalism and militarism? Now, yeah, let's say war. It's not us, it's the enemy over it. It's the Germans, it's the French, and so forth. Fair enough. That argument about the rational versus the irrational tendencies in human nature prevails and is applicable to this day, as is the argument that T.S. Eliot about human beings not necessarily being evil or prone to sin and all that, the products of original sin, but rather lacking moral and spiritual foundations, he meant in a religious sense, of course. And the hollowness comes in terms of that emptiness in human beings, which leads them to be advocates of the ultimate act of destruction in human history, namely mass destruction of other human beings that they don't even know. Just kill them. They're the enemy. Demonize them, objectify them, reduce them to less than human, than animals. Kill them. Okay? So the T.S. Eliot argument, an existentialist argument, was picked up later also by others. And then there is Spengler, and I want to end with him because some of that applies today as well. And that is that civilization, as we know it, based on the foundations of the Enlightenment, is finished, and that people are, and that the future of civilization looks very bad. Because the future, as far as Spengler was concerned, would look more chaotic, more militarist, more authoritarian. Okay. I want to bring my own view here, which is that the elites, military, political, socioeconomic elites, are the ones who have the innate tendencies for mass destruction. They're the ones who have benefited. They're the ones who have been opportunistic throughout history. They're the ones, according to studies that have been done by psychologists today, who display a much higher level of mental instability. Decision makers, by the way, politicians, military people, and business people, decision makers who influence policy, they are the ones who make the decision through the media to indoctrinate the masses to support mass destruction. They are the ones who display innate tendencies to support war. And they have always been. Now, there are studies by psychologists that try to explain why this is, why they have these propensities. The pressures of power, glory, greed, the desire to control the lives of other human beings. It's them. It's not the ordinary person who seeks to live in harmony in society with her fellow human beings and doesn't seek out mass destruction of their fellow beings, yeah, on the other part of the world or in the next in the neighboring country. Thank you very much for listening. The next session is going to be a continuation, basically, of this, but at a different level, different dimension. It's entitled "Violence in Society," and we take that up next time. And again, I thank you. I want to plead with all of you to subscribe to this channel. This is the channel of Asad Alim, and to please send me comments and your observations, and I appreciate it. Thank you. Until next time. Bye-bye.